All right, guys, welcome back to this 9th Key Knowledge Dot Point video in the first outcome of Unit 1. And this one is called The Contributions That Businesses Make. So here is our study design as always with the key knowledge shown for outcome 1. And here's where this one sits. As you can see, we're nicely moving through the outcome here. Only one more key knowledge dot point after this one. And then we've finished the first outcome. And then it's sack time. Now, this one is a little bit interesting. If you look at a lot of the stuff that we've been doing so far, it's all about, where business ideas come from. And then when we've had a business idea, the process we need to go through. So there's certainly sort of some flow through some of the topics we've been looking at. This one's a little bit different. It kind of sits completely out there on its own. And look, to be fair, this very first outcome in Unit 1 and also the first outcome in Unit 3, to be fair, is similar. They tend to throw in a bunch of kind of random business topics to introduce you to some general kind of business ideas and concepts, I guess. So this one doesn't necessarily fit in with everything else. But look, it's a really, really key topic, and it gives you a broader understanding of kind of where businesses fit in terms of the context of broader society. And look, it's something I remember when I did my business degree 30 odd years ago back in the UK. I remember looking at this as well. So it's kind of a standard part of the beginning of any business course that you would do. So anyway, let's get into this. This has always been in the study design, but in the most recent study design, they tweaked it ever so slightly. So you can see here it says the contribution that businesses make to the economic and social well-being of a nation. The focus just used to be on the economy. But I guess, look, as a society, social well-being, personal well-being, mental health, all of this is becoming more talked about, more prevalent as we go through time. So that's been added in. So a slightly different kind of slant on this has been added in to what we already had. So let's explain what we mean. Okay, so the point of all of this is that whilst businesses primarily exist to provide the business owner with an income, to make a profit and all of that good stuff. At the same time, what they're also doing is making a significant contribution to the nation, okay? And this is where they kind of split down now. So they make a significant contribution to the economy, and they also make a significant contribution to the social well-being of the people within the nation. So that second part is the part that's kind of newer. Now, there's lots of different ways you could look at this, but generally speaking, there's 6 ways. If you look at textbooks, generally they're going to cover these contributions. These are not necessarily the only contributions. You could divvy this up different ways, but we're going to focus on these particular 6 contributions that businesses make from an economic point of view. And then we're going to look at these 4 contributions that businesses make to the social well-being of the nation. Okay, so all up, we're going to look at 10 contributions that businesses make, 6 of them kind of economically, and 4 of them from that social well-being point of view. So let's start with the economic side first. What does that actually mean? Okay, now a nation's economic well-being, or how strong, how healthy its economy is measured or indicated by a whole range of factors, like a combination of them. Economic growth, inflation rates, unemployment rates, interest rates, exchange rates, plus many others. So if you look at all of these things together, it would give economists a really good idea of, at that particular point in time, how healthy our economy is. Look, I actually don't know the current figures for a lot of this stuff, but I did hear in the news just this morning. Look, this is January 2023. I'm recording this video, and our inflation rate has just hit the highest level it's been at for the past 3.5 decades. So that's not a positive thing. In terms of some of those other indicators, right now I'm not so sure, but that would be one way in which you would say our health in our economy is kind of taking a negative turn. But some of those other indicators might be increasing. So you need to look at them kind of in totality, that's the word. Look at them all together to give us an idea. Now, why do we want a strong or a healthy economy? Why does that matter? Look, if that's the case, if we have a healthy economy, it allows for more trade in products and services that builds the wealth of the nation. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move through this video to have more of an understanding how that happens. And it also allows us as individuals to access products and services which satisfy our needs and wants. So basically, the more healthy, the stronger our economy is, the more stuff that we have access to and that we can buy, essentially. Now, for this purposes, you can kind of think of Australia as a whole as kind of like being one big business, and then other countries, each country being a business. We're all kind of competing, and that becomes, when we talk about importing and exporting a bit later, that'll kind of maybe make a bit more sense. So the aim is for Australia as a whole to be as successful as possible. And the way that happens is by all the businesses that operate within it, them all being as successful as possible, which, should make sense. If all the businesses are doing better, Australia is a combination of all of those. That means overall Australia is doing better. And that leads to lots and lots of benefits. And we'll be talking about a whole bunch of those as we move through the video as well. So first off, let's move to our 10 contributions. So the first one on our list for economic was employment. Now, businesses obviously employ people to work in them, to produce their goods and their services, whatever they're doing. Therefore, they create employment opportunities. Okay, so businesses create employment opportunities. That's a really key way in which they contribute to the economy. How or why? Look, the more people that have jobs, the more people that can then buy goods and services. Okay, obviously it's harder to buy stuff if you don't have a job, you don't have an income. That supports the growth of businesses and therefore leads to further employment opportunities. So as businesses grow, obviously they need to hire more people, which is what that last part is talking about. So as businesses grow, as businesses become more successful, more people are employed, therefore more people can buy goods and services. And it's kind of like a cyclical thing. Okay. Also, from this, how employment helps, and then there's lots of ways, but let's just keep this fairly simple and short. People also pay tax on their income, which is a direct revenue generator for the federal government. The more people that are paying tax on their income and the more tax they're paying, that's more revenue for the government to spend on services that we all benefit from. All the stuff that the government provides, there's more money for them to do so. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. So the more people are employed, the more tax is being generated. A low unemployment rate is actually a really key indicator of a healthy economy. So the fewer people that are out of work in a nation is one of the really, really good keys or really good indicators that the country's economy is kind of performing quite strongly. The second contribution from our original bullet point list or dot point list was tax revenue. So we already mentioned just now with employment about people paying income tax, but people also pay GST. Now, you may or may not be aware of this, but almost everything that you buy, part of the price that you're paying is GST. We have a GST rate of 10% here in Australia. So 10% of nearly everything you buy. There are certain GST exempt stuff that we can access, but most stuff that we buy incorporated in that is 10% GST levy, which goes straight to government. If you've ever been to America, you might have noticed that when you buy stuff in most states, the price that you pay at the till is actually a little bit higher than the sticker price, if you like, because they actually add their tax on after the point of sale. Whereas in Australia, it's much easier because it's all included in the price. So again, a huge amount of revenue is generated for the government via GST, a huge amount of revenue through income tax. So there's two huge sources of income for the government. But there's a third. Businesses also pay tax on the profits that they make. In just the same way that individuals pay tax on their income, businesses pay tax on their profits. And again, another huge, huge source of income for the government. So the more successful businesses we have operating in Australia, the more tax revenue is generated for the government. And then they can then spend that on all those essential services that government provides, such as healthcare, education, and defence, all the other stuff that they provide. Third, economic contribution that businesses make, infrastructure, growth and development. So I guess the first thing to do here is explain what we mean by infrastructure. That's basically what you see there. It's all the essential facilities and structures and stuff that we need within the nation for it to operate. So transportation systems such as rail networks and roads, water and sewage systems, our communication networks, telephone lines and internet stuff, electrical, gas systems, all of this sort of stuff. That's what we mean by infrastructure. Imagine if we didn't have infrastructure, life would be much different. Now, governments are usually responsible for funding those projects because they're, number one, they're hugely, hugely expensive. And number two, they benefit all of us. So they're the kind of things that governments should be providing. Now, while governments fund those projects, they then employ businesses to create and maintain those facilities, thereby coming back to our employment opportunities. So it creates jobs, and then you get all of the benefits that employment opportunities and creating jobs that we just went through previously also come off the back of that as well. So basically, the better, as well as the better the infrastructure that we have, and Australia generally has pretty decent infrastructure. If you've been to certain other countries, perhaps in Asia, you would see what I mean. The more smoothly, efficiently, and conveniently our society operates. Okay, so this is kind of another benefit of that. Economic contribution number 4, economic growth. Now, this is achieved when the total value of all the goods and services produced by our economy, by Australia, increases over time. So if you add up the revenue of all businesses in Australia, and this is actually done, we'll get to in a minute, if that increases from one year to the next, it means we've seen economic growth. Okay. Now it's measured by something called gross domestic product, which if you also do economics, if you haven't come across that term yet, you certainly will do pretty soon, I would imagine. GDP, gross domestic product. And that's another key indicator as to the health of the economy of a nation. GDP is basically, like I said, kind of the total value of all the goods and services produced in a nation over a specific time period, and usually that's a year. So again, if you just add it up, so if you went to every business in Australia and they do this, you add up the income or the revenue, the sales of every business in Australia over a period of time, over a year, that would give you the GDP, the total GDP for Australia for that year. That's all it is. It's a pretty simple concept. Obviously, the collecting of that information is a different thing, but it is collected. And as you'll see in a minute, nations are compared. So the more the businesses within our economy sell, the higher the GDP is, and therefore higher economic growth. Okay, so hopefully this is making sense to you. Now, if an economy's GDP grows by a faster rate than its population, it generally leads to an increase in material living standards. And that's the level of wealth and comfort we gain from the use of goods and services. Okay, that's a little different from social wellbeing, which we'll look at later. Material living standards. And clearly in Australia, you'll recognise that we have pretty decent material living standards here, as compared with a lot of other nations on earth. Now, if we're actually looking at this material living standards, it makes more sense to look at GDP per capita. And this per capita, I'm assuming you know what that means, per head of population. So in other words, to find Australia's GDP per capita, you would divide the total output, the total value of all the goods and services produced in Australia in a year, divide that by, what is it at the moment, 25 million, whatever it might be. You divide it by how many people live in that nation. As you'll see in a moment, it makes much more sense to look at GDP per capita than it does to look at total GDP. Total GDP can be a little bit misleading. So let's get into some figures to kind of explain some of this and put some of that into context. So the following information I'm going to give you all comes from the World Bank. So they compile these figures constantly for every year. And all the figures we're going to look at are converted to US dollars, as tends to happen when we look at comparisons across different nations. You've obviously got to convert everything to a base currency, and it tends to be the US dollar that we do for this. Okay. So, and these figures show GDP per capita. Now, you can see that this is the top 10 out of 213 countries they rank. So that Monaco, southern tip of France, comes out the highest. So $190,512.70 per head of population that lives in Monaco. Now, I'm just going to point out that this top 10 is kind of meaningless. It's quite deceiving because, I mean, if you look at those countries, some of them you may not even have heard of, but some of them you're going, doesn't seem to make sense to me that would be there. Look, the reason, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but most of these countries you see here, the reason that they appear in this list is that they are tax havens. In other words, they have systems set up where there are benefits for companies to channel income through these nations because they pay less tax on them. So they don't actually generate, most of these countries anyway, don't actually generate much of this wealth themselves. It's purely because other big companies based overseas actually channel income through these. So it kind of, it makes the figure, it skews the figures. So these figures are a little dodgy. So don't, when you look at the top 10 or so, I'll look at some more meaningful figures in a minute, but kind of ignore that. But you can kind of see what we're talking about. You can see the figure, and this is all, the most recent figures we have available. That's what we're going with. So you can see how the figures start and then they kind of come down. If we go to the other end of that table, this kind of makes more sense. So Burundi, you can see, was very last on the list. So their GDP per capita for 2020 was $239 per head of population. Vastly different, obviously, to those figures that we saw at the top. And if you look at those nations, this stuff might start to make a bit more sense to you. Obviously, Africa is pretty heavily represented here. I think there's one or two Asian nations in there, which makes sense when you think about material living standards. If you think, even before looking at this, if somebody said to you, where on earth do you reckon probably more countries have lower material living standards, you probably would have guessed Africa and maybe certain parts of Asia as well. So this does kind of make sense. These figures, again, make more sense. All I've done here is pulled out some key nations, some key European nations, some key world players, and others, just to sort of see where they fit in the ranking. So you can see GDP per capita, US is 12. Now, remember that top 10 is really misleading. I'm not sure what number 11 is, but really US at number 12 is probably right at the top of the real GDP per capita, which isn't skewed by tax for tax purposes by those top 10. You can see Australia sits at number 19. So again, if you think about that, in reality, excluding that top 10, 11, we're sitting certainly within the top 10 nations in terms of material living standards from a world perspective. And that makes sense if you think about it. You were ahead of the UK, good news. So they're at number 30. Look, a couple of key ones there you see at the bottom. I've included those for a specific reason. I said before, GDP per capita is a more real indicator of material living standards than just total GDP. And China and India absolutely demonstrate that. As you can see here, at number 82 in the GDP per capita sits China. But if you did it by total GDP, they actually sit second only to the US. Obviously, they have huge population, a huge output, but they also have a lot of people kind of living in poverty. So once you divide that vast GDP in total that they create, and you divide that by the huge population they have, it actually brings them right down. So second by total GDP, but 82 by GDP per capita. And India, kind of perhaps even more extreme. So they sit seventh in terms of total GDP produced as a nation, but 164th when you divide that by the population. And again, that makes sense because generally speaking, there are some very, very wealthy people that live in both China and India, but generally speaking, material living standards for the average citizen of those nations is nowhere near what we have here in Australia or these countries that you see at the top of the list on the screen right here. So hopefully that kind of makes some sense and puts some context around all the stuff that I am talking about. The fifth economic contribution was export earnings. Exporting, I'm sure you're aware, is selling products and services to countries overseas, and importing is when we buy from overseas. Okay. International trade, generally speaking, right across the world is increasing due to something called globalization. We talk about that a little bit through the course as well. That's basically a growing interdependence on all of the world's economies, kind of on one another, partly due to technology, but there's other things as well. It's quite complex, but basically there's more and more international trade happening than there was ever before. Australian businesses are increasingly exporting their products, and it's easier for them to do so than it once was. And they're also accessing materials and equipment from overseas, in other words, importing more than they were. So both exports and imports are increasing from an Australian perspective. The importing part of that can help reduce business costs for Australian businesses, and that will make sense, to you. The reason that, a lot of the stuff is accessed from overseas, particularly from an Australian perspective, from parts of Asia, because it's not too far away, it reduces the cost for businesses, which is one of the reasons we have access to so much cheap stuff. Yeah, the cost base in those countries that we're accessing stuff from is much lower than Australia, which therefore reduces the price of stuff to us. That can also potentially improve the quality, but certainly the variety of goods and services, which means Australian businesses are able to sell more. Hence leading to that, an increase in economic growth, or contributing to that increase in economic growth. So export earnings lead to economic growth because basically it means bringing money in from other countries. So what I said kind of near the beginning of the video about Australia, thinking about it being a business in and of itself, and other countries being businesses as well. So if we're exporting, if we're selling to other countries, that means we're bringing in money from other countries to Australia, which clearly from an Australian perspective is a good thing. That contributes to our balance of payments. Here's another term for you, the BOP. That's basically a record of transactions between Australia and the rest of the world, and every country keeps a BOP. Basically, the balance of payments is exports less imports. So you add up all the exports, add up all the imports, one take away from the other. So basically what we do, we see economic growth. We see an increase in balance of payments if our exports are increasing faster than our imports. Now, the following set of data I'm going to show you, just to give you an idea, no huge thing to this, but just to give you an idea of the main things that Australia export and import. Look, I don't think there's any surprises here. You can see, a lot of the stuff that we export, natural resources, we're really, really key. So we export a lot of that stuff. You can see the top 10 in terms of categories. So this is the stuff that we are really big in exporting. On the flip side of that, here's the top 10 things that we import. Look, just one, I don't know how this has changed over the decades. But cars being at number 2, that's a huge figure. Look, as of 2017, we no longer have a car manufacturing industry in Australia. Toyota, Ford, Holden, all three, 2017 or the couple of years prior to that, closed down all their manufacturing operations. So basically, if you're buying a car in Australia now, it's been imported. It's not been made in Australia. So that cars thing is the entire car industry, basically. So it's not a surprise. And I'm pretty sure 10, 20 years ago, that would not have been quite as high in that list as it is right now. Right, moving on to our sixth and final economic contribution, research and development. Now, we talked about R&D in the very first key knowledge dot point, which was when we talked about R&D being a source of business opportunity. So if you could go back and refer to your notes, have a quick look and see what we said about R&D then. In that video, I mentioned some of the vast figures that some of the bigger tech companies that you see here spend, 19, 28, $43 billion a year, huge amount of money being spent on R&D by these very successful world-leading businesses. Now, the Australian Bureau of Statistics identified in the year 2019 to 2020, so one year, Australian business spent $18 billion on R&D. I guess that the first thing to point out there is now that $18 billion would be in Australian dollars, whilst the 19 and 28 and 43 you see there would be US. But even if you converted the Australian into US dollars, you could see that some of these companies, individual companies, are spending more per year on R&D than Australia as a whole, which is staggering. But regardless, that aside, that $18.7 billion spend in Australia by Australian businesses contributes to improvements in existing products. It leads to the development of new products and processes. All of that leads to lower costs, which leads to increased demand, higher sales, and all of that stuff results in economic growth through improvements in businesses and businesses becoming more successful. So that's how R&D is an economic contribution. Now we're moving on to our second list. This list is much quicker. Social wellbeing, what does that mean? I think you've obviously got an idea in your mind what social wellbeing means. But now we're talking about the non-material living standards. All that other stuff we were talking about, the economy, is more to do with material living standards. Now we're talking about non-material living standards. Basically, how well we live, what our quality of life is like, influenced by factors such as general happiness, access to things like education, healthcare, the quality of the environment in which we live, crime rates, political freedom, all of this kind of stuff, are factors that are included when we look at social well-being. Now, businesses don't just provide people with an income. That's obviously a key thing. The reason we go to work is of an income, but there's also a range of other benefits that we get from being employed. Okay, sense of self-esteem, potentially. You may not actually recognize that until, at some period in life, if you become unemployed. Self-esteem can really take a knock, particularly if it takes you a long time to get a job again. And self-esteem, if your self-esteem takes a bit of a nosedive, mental well-being and all that other stuff, it's all kind of linked together. Sense of belonging, often, the business you work for, the organization that you work for, you feel a sense of belonging. You're part of a team, you're part of something, and a sense of perhaps contributing to society, which you don't have if you don't have a job. Because if you don't have a job, you could potentially say you're taking from society, but not necessarily contributing in the same way that somebody that has a job does. Okay, not wanting to get too political about it. All of these things combined lead to an increase in our happiness, our self-fulfillment, and general well-being. So being a little bit more specific, the first contribution, increased levels of general happiness. So employed people, and I'm going to preface all of these with this is generalizing, okay? This isn't black and white. This isn't hard and fast. Generally speaking, what we're going to be talking about is the case, okay? This isn't the be-all and end-all. Employed people, generally speaking, are more likely to be happier and more fulfilled as they're earning a regular income. Doesn't mean that unemployed people are not happy, and you can't have an unemployed person who is more happy than someone who's employed. That definitely is not the case, I can tell you. But generally speaking, if you took someone who went from being employed to then being unemployed, usually they're probably going to be less happy. And why? Look, lots of reasons, but one reason is stress. Being unemployed is stressful from a financial point of view, if nothing else. How you're going to pay your bills, particularly in today, 2023, when costs of living is increasing. People want steady income so they can afford to live. Okay. Lower crime and homelessness rate. So again, generally speaking, countries with lower unemployment rates tend to also have lower crime and lower homelessness. I think that makes complete sense. Okay. More people that have jobs, that means more people that can afford housing and therefore don't go homeless. And more people that have jobs and have an income, there's less incentive to commit crime as a source of income. So, of course, when we're talking about crime, we're not talking necessarily about violent crime and all that sort of thing, but we're talking about a certain category of crime, where crime leads to income. So theft, for example, just one example. So I think that one totally makes sense. Okay, so if we have less people out of work, generally speaking, we see crime and homelessness dropping as well, which obviously links into social well-being. The third one, improvements in mental health. Again, generally, higher employment rates lead to better mental health in a population overall. Happiness, less financial stress, all of that stuff which contributes to our personal mental health. But another aspect, which you may or probably not be familiar with, is that because there's such a focus on mental health, generally speaking, in society these days, pretty much all large businesses, probably most medium businesses, organizations now have like mental health services and counseling services, that sort of thing, that their employees can access if they're struggling, if they have any issues. So, for example, as an employee of the Department of Education in Victoria, if I am feeling that my mental health, for whatever reason, is on the decline, I have access now to counselling services and a range of other services who I can talk to. It's all provided free, and most businesses do something similar now. So more and more people now have access to help with mental health than they did because it's being provided by the business that they work for or the organisation that they work for. All right, guys, a slight change of scenery for this last one. Bit of an editing balls up there. But nonetheless, let's move on through to the final contribution for the video and the fourth and final one for social well-being. Now, there is an increasing focus on businesses, has been over the last few decades, about businesses being corporate socially responsible, CSR. CSR is a term, I'm not even sure if I've already introduced that term already at this stage, but if I have, I would have said that this is the most common theme, common topic, if you like, throughout the entire 2-year business management course. We talk about this a lot and we relate it to a lot of the different things that we do from outcome 2 onwards. So it's a theme that you're going to become very, very familiar with. But if I've not talked about it already, I don't want to go into too much detail here. But the idea of social responsibility is businesses acting in an ethical way, in an ethical manner. And like I said, like a few generations ago, it wasn't really a thing. Businesses or the society wasn't really aware of ethics and stuff so much. But now it's a really, really hot topic, and every business wants to be seen to be being ethical and being socially responsible. So that's what we're talking about here. So look, and this, the fact that businesses are being socially responsible leads to a range of benefits for our social well-being. So just 3 examples here. More and more these days, because of this focus on social responsibility, employees and customers tend to be treated more fairly and more ethically than they once perhaps were. Because businesses don't want to be seen to be doing the wrong thing by their employees. So there's one benefit in terms of social well-being that's come off the back of CSR from businesses. Secondly, most businesses these days are trying to reduce their carbon footprint, be a bit more green in their operations. So therefore, more businesses are trying to preserve, protect, or even improve the environment, which obviously has a benefit to us in terms of our social well-being, in terms of our non-material living standards, because it means that potentially we have a healthier, nicer environment to live in than we may well have done if businesses had continued as they were years ago of basically buggering up the environment. And thirdly, working for a socially responsible business. Now, some businesses have a real focus on this, and that can just allow people to feel that they're doing some good by working for a business that is being socially responsible. And again, if you feel that you're doing that, it can lead to an increase in your general happiness and your self-fulfillment and all of that kind of good stuff, just by dint of you working for a business that is doing the right thing. And that is it. So there's just summarizing there. So by now you should be able to hopefully just explain how each of those 10 things, those 10 factors, 10 elements, we want to call them, can contribute to, first off, the economic well-being of the nation, and then the social well-being of the inhabitants within the nation. So that's it for that video, guys. Key Knowledge 9 done. The final video for Key Knowledge 10 I will see you at. Cheers for now.